If someone had told me that my marriage to Samantha would implode because of a parking ticket, I would have laughed it off as a bad joke. But life's got a dark sense of humor sometimes. We'd been married for 6 years, long enough to fall into routines, to believe that comfort meant security. But routines can be deceiving, and security can be an illusion. Samantha was the type of person who could charm her way out of anything: a parking fine, a missed appointment, an awkward dinner party. She had this easy, magnetic energy, the kind that pulled people in. I used to find it captivating. I thought it was just part of who she was, until I realized it wasn't charm. It was manipulation dressed up with a pretty smile. Things had been off for a while. She was distant, glued to her phone more than usual, brushing off questions with quick, rehearsed answers. Late nights out with vague excuses. I told myself she was just stressed, that work was piling up. I ignored the signs because it was easier than confronting the growing pit in my stomach. Then came the day everything unraveled. It was a regular Tuesday, one of those mindless weekdays where nothing seems significant, until it does. I left work early after a cancelled meeting, driving home in that daze you get from the monotony of routine. As I turned onto our street, I noticed Samantha's car parked oddly along the side of an empty lot. Not the grocery store, not anywhere she'd mentioned she'd be. Just there. Curiosity mixed with an uneasy feeling pushed me to pull over. At first, I thought maybe she'd broken down. But as I got closer, I realized the car wasn't broken. It was rocking. My chest tightened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I approached quietly, heart pounding in my ears, and there she was, Samantha. In the back seat. Straddling a man in a police uniform. I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to catch up with my eyes. It wasn't just the physical act, it was the ease of it, the casual betrayal, like it was nothing more than an appointment she'd squeezed into her day. She didn't see me at first, too caught up in the moment. But when she did, her face shifted from shock to something else, annoyance, maybe even irritation. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong by standing there. She scrambled, pulling at her clothes, her face flushed. She stepped out of the car, hair disheveled, eyes wide but defiant. "Ryan, this isn't what it looks like," she blurted, the cliché hitting me harder than her actual betrayal, but it was exactly what it looked like. And in that moment, something in me broke, not with rage, not with heartbreak. Just clarity. Our marriage wasn't in trouble. It was over. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind spinning while everything around me felt eerily still. Samantha fumbled with her clothes, trying to regain some semblance of control, but there was no recovering from what I'd just seen. The man in the uniform, Officer Derek Thompson, as I'd later learn, barely looked at me, his face a mixture of indifference and mild inconvenience, like he'd just been interrupted during a coffee break, not caught having sex with someone's wife. Samantha finally managed to zip up her jeans and smooth down her hair, her face flushed, not with guilt, but with frustration. She took a deep breath and stepped toward me, her eyes sharp, like I was the one who needed explaining to do. "Ryan, I can explain," she started, her voice shaky but still trying to hold on to some authority in the situation. I let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, enlighten me. Because from where I'm standing, it seems pretty straightforward." She rolled her eyes, a reaction that cut deeper than any apology could have. "It's not what you think." I clenched my jaw, feeling the heat rise in my chest. "Really? Because it looks like you're sleeping with a cop in the back of your car. Pretty hard to misinterpret." She glanced back at Derek, who was now casually buckling his belt like this was just another Tuesday for him. "No shame. No remorse." Samantha turned back to me, her face shifting into that manipulative calm she always used when she wanted to win an argument. "It's not serious, Ryan. It was just a thing. I didn't mean for you to find out this way." I stared at her, the words hitting me like static, empty, meaningless. "You didn't mean for me to find out?" I echoed, my voice low, trembling with restrained anger. "That's your takeaway here?" She sighed, crossing her arms defensively. Look, I was going to tell you eventually. Things have been off between us for a while, and, I cut her off, my voice sharp. So instead of talking to me, you decided to screw a cop. Was this supposed to be your way of fixing things? She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, realizing there was nothing she could say that would make sense of this. That I took a step back, shaking my head. You're unbelievable. Derek finally decided to speak, his voice calm, like he was breaking up a minor dispute. Look, man, I didn't know she was married. That made me laugh, short, bitter, humorless. Oh, well, that makes it so much better. Thanks for clearing that up. I didn't wait for more excuses. I turned around, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I felt numb, like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. Back at home, I sat in the silence, staring at nothing, trying to process the chaos that had just become my life. The house felt different, smaller, colder, like it was holding its breath with me. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just sat there, letting the reality sink in. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought I had, it was all a lie. And now, I had to figure out what to do next. The house was too quiet when I got back, that suffocating kind of silence that makes every sound louder. The creak of the floorboards under my feet, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, it all felt like noise against the roaring in my head. I dropped my keys on the counter, the metallic clink echoing louder than it should have. I stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, feeling everything. Anger. Betrayal. Confusion. But underneath all of that was a hollow emptiness, like the core of my chest had just been scooped out. I sank onto the couch, my hands in my hair, trying to make sense of it. How did we get here? Just yesterday, I thought we were a typical married couple, navigating the usual ups and downs. Sure, things had been off between us, but I thought that was normal after a few years of marriage. I didn't think it was the prelude to infidelity. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping me out of my spiral. It was Samantha. Samantha, can we talk? I'm coming home. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her sit in the mess she'd made. But another part, stubborn, maybe desperate, needed answers. I typed a quick response. Me, fine. About 30 minutes later, I heard her car pull into the driveway. The familiar sound of her keys jingling as she unlocked the door sent a fresh wave of anger through me. She walked in like nothing had happened, dropping her purse on the console table, avoiding my eyes. She sat across from me, her face composed but her eyes betraying the tension. Ryan, she started, her voice low, almost rehearsed. I'm sorry. I let out a bitter laugh. You're sorry? For what? Getting caught? She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Like this? I snapped, leaning forward. You mean, I wasn't supposed to catch you having sex with a cop in the back of your car? She winced, finally meeting my gaze. It was a mistake. I shook my head, standing up, pacing the room because sitting still felt impossible. A mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. This, I gestured wildly, was a choice. Multiple choices. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. Things have been different between us for a while, Ryan. You've been distant. I stopped pacing, turning to face her, my anger simmering just below the surface. So, that's your excuse? I was distant, so you decided to screw a cop in the back seat of your car? She didn't respond. She just stared at me, her expression shifting from guilt to something else, defensiveness. I felt invisible, she whispered. Like I didn't matter anymore. Her words hit harder than I expected. Not because I believed her, but because I realized how easy it was for her to rewrite the narrative, to paint herself as the victim in a situation she created. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. You could have talked to me, Samantha. You could have said something. But you didn't. You just cheated. She stood up then, frustration flickering across her face. I didn't mean for it to get this far. Yeah, I muttered, affairs usually start with a heartfelt plan, right? We stood there, the space between us filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, she broke the silence. So, what now? She asked quietly. I stared at her, the woman I'd shared 6 years of my life with, and felt like I was looking at a stranger. I don't know, I replied honestly. But I know I can't do this anymore. Her face fell slightly, but she didn't argue. Maybe because she knew there was nothing left to say, she packed a bag that night, the tension thick and unspoken. I watched her leave without stopping her, without asking her to stay, and when the door finally closed behind her, I realized something. The hardest part wasn't watching her walk away. It was realizing I didn't feel relieved. I just felt empty. The morning after Samantha left, I woke up expecting to feel something, anger, sadness, regret, but all I felt was numbness. The kind of emptiness that didn't creep in quietly but settled like a thick fog, clouding everything. The bed felt too big, the sheets cold where her warmth used to be, and the faint scent of her perfume still lingered in the air like a ghost. I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. It felt surreal, like my life had split into 2 timelines, the one where I was happily married and the one where I was just this. Alone, betrayed, confused. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feet hitting the floor with a heaviness I hadn't known before. The house was eerily quiet. No sounds of Samantha shuffling through the kitchen, no morning routine noises. Just silence, thick and uncomfortable. I found myself walking through the house like it was a museum of our marriage, every photo on the wall, every piece of furniture, even the coffee mug with her lipstick stain felt like evidence of a life that wasn't real anymore. I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring out the window, watching the world go on like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Samantha. Samantha, I'm sorry about everything. I didn't mean to hurt you. I stared at the screen, my jaw tightening. Didn't mean to hurt me? What did she think would happen? Affairs don't come with a safety net for emotions. I didn't reply. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and left the house. I needed air. I needed to feel something other than the suffocating emptiness. I ended up at a small park near our neighborhood, the one we used to walk through on lazy Sunday afternoons. I sat on a bench, watching families, couples, people just living. It felt like the world was mocking me with its normalcy. I thought about the last 6 years, our wedding day, the trips we took, the late-night talks. Were they all lies? Or did they mean something to her once? That's the part that hurt the most, not the betrayal itself, but the questioning of everything that came before it. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling through old photos of us. Smiling faces, vacations, holidays. We looked happy. But were we? Or was I just too blind to see the cracks forming? I deleted the photos one by one. It felt therapeutic in a way, like erasing pieces of the past to make room for something new. But it didn't bring closure. It just left more empty space. I spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly, avoiding going back to the house. Because going back meant facing the reality that it was no longer our home. It was just a house now. 4 walls filled with memories I didn't want anymore. When I finally walked through the front door that evening, the emptiness hit me harder than before. I stood in the living room, staring at the spot where Samantha's keys used to hang, where her jacket used to be draped over the chair. She was gone, but the echoes of her betrayal were still everywhere, and I didn't know how to make them stop. The days after Samantha left blurred together like smudged ink on a page. Morning, afternoon, night, they all felt the same, stitched together by an unrelenting silence. The house was too clean, too organized, like her absence had left space but no warmth. Her coffee mug was still in the sink, a lone reminder of what used to be our routine. I stared at it for a long time, then finally washed it and tucked it away, as if that simple act could erase her fingerprints from my life. I avoided people. I didn't answer texts from friends who noticed I'd gone quiet. What would I even say? Hey, just found out my wife was sleeping with a cop to get out of a fine. How's your week going? The humiliation hit harder than I expected. Not just because of what she did, but because of what it said about me. Was I that easy to lie to? That blind, work became my escape, not because I loved it, but because it gave me something to focus on that wasn't her. I drowned in emails, projects, meaningless tasks. The mindless routine numbed the ache, even if just for a few hours. But coming home was the worst part. Walking through the door, greeted only by my own footsteps, was a cruel reminder that I was alone. One night, after another pointless day at work, I found myself scrolling through old messages between us. Stupid, I know. But it was like picking at a scab. You know it'll hurt, but you do it anyway. There were texts filled with, "I love you," and plans for trips we never took. I read one where she'd said, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic that I wanted to call her. To scream, to ask why, to make her feel even an ounce of the weight she'd dumped on me. But I didn't. What was the point? She'd already shown me who she was. Instead, I grabbed a notebook from the drawer. It was one of those gifts she gave me years ago, a just because thing, with a cheesy note inside, "For your thoughts. I love you." I flipped past the note and started writing. Not to be poetic or profound. Just to get the words out of my head. She lied. She cheated. But what hurts more is that I didn't see it coming. Was I that blind? Or did I just not want to see? I stared at the page after I finished, the words bleeding into the paper like the truth had finally found a place to land. That I kept writing, page after page, not caring if it made sense. Anger, sadness, confusion, it all spilled out. It didn't make me feel better, but at least the words weren't trapped inside me anymore. After hours of pouring my thoughts onto paper, I sat back, exhausted. Not the kind of tired sleep could fix, but the kind that settles deep in your chest. That I realized something then. The pain wasn't just about losing her. It was about losing the version of myself that believed she'd never leave. Writing in that notebook became my lifeline, a silent witness to thoughts I couldn't say out loud. Every night after work, I'd come home, sit on the edge of the couch, and just unload. Some pages were angry scribbles, others sad, confused, or filled with questions that had no answers. It wasn't therapy, but it was something, a way to release the tension bottled up inside me. But the pages couldn't talk back. A week passed before Ethan, my best friend since college, finally showed up unannounced. I hadn't been answering his texts, and clearly, he wasn't going to let that slide. He knocked once, then let himself in with the spare key I'd forgotten he had. "Dude," he said the moment he saw me, "you look like hell." I didn't argue. I probably did. I hadn't been sleeping much, barely eating, surviving on black coffee and whatever leftovers I could stomach. My beard had grown out, uneven and rough, matching the state of my life. Ethan sat down across from me, studying me for a minute. "You gonna tell me what's going on, or do I have to guess?" I didn't plan to say anything. I thought I'd just brush him off, tell him I was fine, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "Samantha cheated on me." It felt weird saying it out loud, like the words didn't belong to me. Ethan blinked, processing, then leaned back. "Wait, what? Since when?" I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling. "I caught her. With a cop. In the back of her car." Ethan's eyes widened, then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "A cop? Are you serious?" I nodded, the bitterness rising in my throat. "Dead serious." He shook his head, still in disbelief. "Man, that's messed up. No advice. No empty words. Just that simple acknowledgement, it's messed up." And it was exactly what I needed to hear. We sat there for a while, not saying much. He didn't press for details, which I appreciated. Eventually, he stood up, grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, and tossed one to me. "To starting over," he said, raising his bottle that I hesitated for a second, then clinked mine against his. "To starting over." The beer tasted like cheap regret, but it was cold, and it dulled the edges of my thoughts for a bit. After Ethan left, the house felt emptier than before. But something had shifted. The words were out now, no longer just ink on paper. They existed in the real world, and somehow, that made them easier to carry. That night, I didn't write in the notebook that I didn't need to. Instead, I sat in the quiet and let myself feel it all, the anger, the sadness, the betrayal, without trying to drown it in words. And for the first time since Samantha left, I realized something important: that I wasn't broken, just bruised, and bruises fade. The days after Ethan's visit felt different. Not better, exactly, but less suffocating. It's funny how simply saying the truth out loud, "She cheated on me," can shift something inside you. The words didn't fix anything, but they stopped feeling like a secret I had to protect. That I started going through the motions of life again. Work, gym, sleep, repeat. The gym wasn't about some cliché revenge body or trying to distract myself. It was just the only place where my brain shut up long enough for me to feel something other than disappointment. There was a strange comfort in the burn of muscles and the rhythmic pounding of my feet against the treadmill. Pain I could control, unlike the emotional mess Samantha left behind. One evening after work, I found myself scrolling through my phone, deleting old photos and messages. Our anniversary trips, selfies from lazy Sundays, her "good morning" texts, all of it went into the digital trash without hesitation. But then I hit a folder I'd forgotten, a video from our wedding day. For some reason, I opened it. There we were, dancing under strings of warm lights, her head resting on my shoulder, both of us smiling like we had it all figured out. Watching it felt surreal, like observing strangers who had no idea what was waiting for them down the road. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. Just disconnected, like it was someone else's life I'd stumbled upon. That I deleted the video. The next morning, I woke up early, unable to shake this restless energy. I grabbed my keys and decided to go for a drive. No destination in mind, just the open road. There's something therapeutic about driving with no purpose, just you, the hum of the engine, and the horizon stretching out ahead. That I ended up at a small beach about an hour outside of town. I sat on the sand, watching the waves crash against the shore, the salty air cool against my face. The ocean doesn't care about your problems. It just keeps going, wave after wave, indifferent to your heartbreak. That I pulled out my notebook, the one that had been my silent therapist for weeks, and started writing again. She's gone. The marriage is over. But I'm still here. Breathing. Living. Maybe that's enough for now. I closed the notebook and just sat there, letting the sounds of the waves fill the empty spaces inside me. Later that week, Ethan dragged me out to a bar. I wasn't in the mood, but he insisted. "You need to be around people who don't suck," he said, which was hard to argue with. The bar was nothing special: dim lighting, sticky floors, the faint smell of beer and bad decisions lingering in the air. But it was loud and alive, the exact opposite of my apartment. While Ethan was busy challenging someone to a game of darts, I found myself at the bar, nursing a drink, lost in thought. That's when she sat down next to me. Claire, she wasn't the kind of woman who demanded attention. No flashy outfit, no exaggerated confidence. Just a quiet presence, like she belonged wherever she was. She ordered her drink, then glanced at me. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said, her tone light but not intrusive. I chuckled softly. "More like the weight of a bad year." She smiled. "Yeah, I've had a few of those." We talked. Nothing deep, just easy conversation about random things, music, books, the weirdness of people watching in bars. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about Samantha. I wasn't thinking about the betrayal or the pain. I was just there. When I left that night, I didn't get Claire's number. I wasn't ready for that. But the encounter stuck with me, not because I felt some spark of romance, but because it reminded me of something simple: there's life beyond the wreckage, you just have to be willing to look for it. And for the first time since my marriage fell apart, I realized I wanted to. After that night at the bar with Claire, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a grand epiphany or some sudden burst of clarity. Just a quiet realization: life doesn't pause because you're heartbroken. It keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. And maybe that's the hardest part, knowing the world doesn't care that your life fell apart. That I kept going to the gym, not just for the routine but because it gave me a sense of control. Each rep, each drop of sweat, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I'd let slip away. There was comfort in the rhythm, the way my body heard in all the right ways. Unlike the ache Samantha left behind, work was the same, monotonous but necessary. The small talk, the pointless meetings, the grind of deadlines, it all blurred together, a distraction I didn't even realize I needed. But nights were still the hardest. That's when the quiet crept in, whispering reminders of what I'd lost. One night, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, the darkness feeling heavier than usual. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly, and stumbled upon a contact I hadn't deleted yet. Samantha. My thumb hovered over her name, tempted to call, to demand answers I knew I'd never get. But then I remembered her face that day in the car, flushed, disheveled, unapologetic. The way she tried to twist her guilt into my fault. The excuses. The lies that I put the phone down, that I didn't need answers from her, that I needed to stop asking questions that didn't matter anymore. Instead, I grabbed my notebook. The pages were filled with anger, grief, confusion, a tangled mess of emotions I'd spilled over the past few weeks. I flipped to a blank page and wrote, "I don't need closure from her. I need it from myself." The words felt heavy, but also freeing. The next day, Ethan showed up again, this time with coffee instead of beer. "Thought you might want to do something other than sulk," he said, tossing me a cup. "Is sulking my brand now?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Pretty much," he smirked. "But you're getting better at it." He dragged me out of the apartment, insisting we go for a hike. Nature was never really my thing, but something about being out in the open, away from the walls that held too many memories, felt necessary. That we walked in silence for a while, the sound of crunching leaves under our feet filling the gaps. Eventually, Ethan spoke. "You know, she's not worth this." I didn't respond right away, just kept walking, the weight of his words settling over me. "It's not about her anymore," I finally said. "It's about me." He nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. That's the thing about friends who've known you forever, they don't need the full story to get the message. When we reached the top of the trail, we sat on a large rock, overlooking the expanse of trees below. The view was breathtaking, but what struck me was the stillness. No noise, no distractions, just the world existing as it always had, indifferent to my heartbreak. And that's when it hit me: the world doesn't owe me healing. It's something I had to do for myself. A few days later, I went back to that same bar. Not to find Claire or chase some forced connection, but because I wanted to be somewhere that wasn't soaked in memories of Samantha. To be in a space that felt new, even if it was just a dimly lit bar with bad music and overpriced drinks. And to my surprise, Claire was there. She recognized me instantly, offering a warm smile as if we were old friends, back for another round of life's bad decisions. She joked that I laughed, genuinely this time. Something like that. We talked again, about everything and nothing. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people sharing a moment in time. When I left that night, I felt lighter, not because she fixed me, but because I realized I was capable of feeling something other than broken. And that was enough for now. After that night with Claire, I realized something important: not every moment had to be defined by what Samantha did. For weeks, maybe months, every breath I took, every decision I made, felt tangled up in her betrayal. But sitting there, laughing with someone who didn't know me as the guy whose wife cheated, was like cracking a window open after being trapped in a room too long. The air was different. I didn't rush into anything with Claire. This wasn't a story about falling into someone new to fix what was broken. She wasn't a distraction, she was a reminder that life moves on, even if you're not ready. Over the next few weeks, we met up here and there. Nothing serious. Coffee after work, an occasional late-night conversation over texts about dumb things like our mutual hatred for pineapple on pizza or the worst songs ever played on repeat. It was easy, unforced, and most importantly, it was about now, not the past, but healing isn't linear. One night, I found myself scrolling through old photos again. Why? I don't even know. Maybe I thought I'd be immune to it by now. But there she was, Samantha, frozen in time, smiling like she never broke my heart. That sting crept back in, sharp and familiar. The difference? This time, I didn't drown in it. Instead, I picked up my notebook, the one that had been my silent companion through it all, and flipped to a fresh page. She's a scar, not an open wound. And it was true. The ache wasn't as raw anymore. It was just there. A part of my story, but not the whole book. That I started taking care of myself differently, not out of spite, not to prove anything, but because I deserved it. Morning runs cleared my head, books replaced the mindless scrolling, and I even signed up for a photography class, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. One afternoon after class, Claire and I grabbed coffee. She noticed the camera slung over my shoulder, so, she said with a playful grin, future world-famous photographer or just trying to look artsy at coffee shops? I laughed. Maybe both. She tilted her head, studying me for a second. You seem lighter. That caught me off guard. I hadn't realized it, but she was right. The heaviness that had been clinging to me like a shadow wasn't as strong anymore. Later that evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the sunset, and thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the pain, the nights I thought I'd never feel normal again, and yet, here I was, still standing, still breathing, still me. That I opened my notebook one last time and wrote, I thought she broke me. But all she did was make space for me to find myself again. I closed the notebook, realizing I didn't need it anymore, because I wasn't surviving anymore. That I was living. Weeks turned into months, and life settled into something new, not perfect, but real. The sharp edges of Samantha's betrayal had dulled, leaving behind a scar I could acknowledge without flinching. I wasn't waking up with that hollow ache anymore. My days weren't haunted by the constant replay of what-ifs and whys. Instead, there was just life. Work, photography, morning runs, occasional meetups with Claire, and the simple comfort of peace. But closure has a strange way of showing up when you least expect it. One random afternoon, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, her voice hit me like a faint echo from a past life. Ryan, it's Samantha. I didn't feel the rush of anger I thought I would. No racing heart, no clenched fists, just calm. I was hoping we could talk, she continued, her voice softer than I remembered, missing the sharp edge she used when she was defensive. After a brief pause, I said, okay. We agreed to meet at a small park not far from where we used to live. Neutral ground. I didn't dress up. Didn't overthink it. Just jeans, a hoodie, and the quiet confidence of someone who didn't owe her anything anymore. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench, her posture a mix of nerves and rehearsed composure. She looked different. Not drastically, but enough. Or maybe I was just seeing her without the filter of love and hope I'd worn for years. Hey, she greeted awkwardly as I sat down beside her, leaving a comfortable gap between us. Hey, I replied, my tone neutral. There was a long pause, filled only by the sounds of distant traffic and kids playing in the background. I've been thinking about reaching out for a while, she started, her eyes fixed on the ground. I needed to say I'm sorry. Really sorry. I nodded slightly, not to accept it, but to acknowledge her words. She kept talking, filling the space with apologies and explanations, how she felt lost, how she'd made mistakes, how none of it was my fault. But honestly, I wasn't listening to every detail. I didn't need to. This wasn't for her anymore. When she finally stopped, her eyes met mine, searching for something, maybe forgiveness, maybe validation. But I didn't owe her either. I'm glad you found the courage to say that, I said quietly. But I don't need it. Her face shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise. I don't hate you, I continued. I'm not even angry anymore. You did what you did, and yeah, it broke me for a while. But I rebuilt myself without you. I'm good now. Really? She nodded, blinking back whatever emotion she was trying to hold in. After a brief silence, I stood up. Take care of yourself, Samantha. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say more, but I didn't wait. That I walked away, and with every step, I felt lighter. That night, back on my balcony, I thought about everything, our marriage, the heartbreak, the messiness of healing. And for the first time, it wasn't a painful reflection. It was just part of the story. That I grabbed my old notebook, flipping through the pages filled with anger, sadness, and confusion. Then I turned to the very last blank page and wrote, "She was a lesson, not a loss." I closed the notebook, not out of habit, but with purpose, because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a life I built on my own terms, and I was finally free. After that final conversation with Samantha, it felt like a door had quietly clicked shut behind me, not with a dramatic slam, but with the soft certainty of something truly over. There were no lingering questions, no burning need for closure because, without realizing it, I'd already found it. She was just a chapter I'd finished reading, and I didn't feel the urge to flip back anymore. Life moved on, as it always does. My mornings became less about surviving the day and more about looking forward to it. The small rituals I'd built, morning runs, photography, random coffee meetups with Ethan, weren't just coping mechanisms anymore. They were just life. Simple, steady, and mine. Claire and I stayed in touch. What started as casual conversations turned into deeper ones, about fears, dreams, and everything in between. She never asked about Samantha, and I never felt the need to bring her up. That was the beauty of it. Our connection wasn't built on the ruins of my past but on the foundation of who I was becoming. One crisp autumn evening, we met for coffee at a little cafe tucked away from the city noise. We sat outside, wrapped in light jackets, the cool breeze carrying the scent of roasted beans and fallen leaves. We talked about everything: photography projects, books, bad date stories, and the random quirks of people we observed around us. At some point, Claire leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. "You seem different," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "Lighter." I smiled, not out of politeness, but because she was right. "I feel different." She nodded, not pressing, just letting the words settle. I realized then that healing doesn't come with a finish line. There's no moment where you cross over, arms raised in victory. It's quieter than that, a slow realization that the things that used to hurt don't hold the same power anymore. Later that night, back at my apartment, I found myself looking at the old notebook again. I hadn't touched it since the day I wrote, "She was a lesson, not a loss." But this time, I didn't open it to pour out my pain. I opened it to close the story for good. I flipped to the back, found one last blank page, and wrote, "This is where the story ends. Not because I'm broken, but because I'm whole." I closed the notebook, placed it in a drawer, and felt no need to open it again. The next morning, the sun rose like it always does, unapologetically bright, indifferent to the past. But this time, I greeted it with a different heart, because I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. And I was finally free to write the next chapter. Months passed, and life continued, not with dramatic twists or sudden revelations, but with the quiet comfort of normalcy. The days felt lighter, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because I had changed. The weight I'd been carrying after Samantha's betrayal had slowly dissolved, leaving space for something new, peace. That I found myself thriving in the simplicity of my routine. My mornings were filled with runs along the river, the cool air against my skin a reminder that I was alive, present. Work felt purposeful again, not just a distraction. Photography became more than a hobby. It was how I learned to see the world differently, through new lenses, both literally and figuratively. Claire and I grew closer, not because I needed her to fill a void, but because there was no void to fill. She was a friend, then something more, not a replacement, not a rebound, but a person who met me where I was, without expectations or baggage. One evening, we were sitting on my balcony, the city lights flickering below us like distant stars. She was flipping through one of my photo albums, pausing at a shot of an old, crumbling bridge I'd taken during a solo road trip. "This one's my favorite," she said, tracing the photo gently. "It's like it's standing strong despite the cracks." I looked at her, realizing she wasn't just talking about the bridge. "Yeah," I replied softly. "It is." Later that night, when she'd gone home, I pulled out the old notebook one last time. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to give it a proper ending. Flipping through the pages felt like flipping through memories, raw, messy, painful, but real. Every scribbled sentence, every tear-streaked line, was part of the journey that brought me here. I turned to the final page, the last blank space, and wrote, "This isn't a story about heartbreak. It's a story about healing." She broke a promise, but I kept mine, to myself. To be okay. And I am. I closed the notebook gently, no dramatic flourish, just quiet acknowledgement. Then, without hesitation, I placed it in a box with other keepsakes from that time in my life, not to forget, but to honor the lessons learned. As I turned off the light and lay down, I realized I wasn't thinking about Samantha anymore. I was thinking about tomorrow, and that's how I knew the story was over. Because the best part of healing isn't getting over someone. It's realizing you never needed them to be whole in the first place.